I call them heretics and heroes. If you really look at the history of defense innovation, almost none of it happened because of the system. All of it happened.
It's always the heretics who break the rules who do it, right?
We can go all the way back to Winston Churchill. So Churchill, as the head of the Royal Navy,
World War I, before World War I.
Yeah, exactly. Built the tank. How crazy is that the British Army was like, I got horses. I don't need these tank thing. Go away. And he built land ships as a rogue renegade effort.
I love that he called them, it had to be land ships.
Of
so
course,
he's allowed to build them.
Wouldn't be in his job jar.
It's one of my favorite books, actually, is when he writes about before World War I. And it's like, he just like fired all these bureaucrats and pushed everyone out of the way. I feel like it'd be harder today to have someone that strong able to push through, but it's needed, huh? Yeah,
you build up, the entropy of the universe is against you. You build up these bad practices. And I think part of his understanding is like, it's not an ad hominem critique. It's a structural critique. The other example I love is Andrew Higgins, this foul-mouthed Scots-Irishman down in Louisiana. He was anyone from Louisiana knows Higgins. He was a boat builder. And in the 20s, he observed how Chinese bootleggers were able to build these shallow draft boats to kind of outrun the policing. And he used that to inspire his own boat building. So Higgins, he built the boat. The Navy wouldn't let him compete. Then finally, there was an enterprising Marine first lieutenant who got him in. He won the competition. Then the Navy tried to steal his IP and build the boats themselves. They couldn't even steal the IP.
Amazing.
In the end, 92% of all boats in World War II were Higgins boats.
92%.
The boys would not have landed at Normandy or Iwo Jima without the Higgins boats.
I mean, you see this even in the Civil War. You had I have upstairs a Gatling gun with the patents from the 1860s, but they weren't used because people were ignoring them because they didn't think it made sense. Like the Renegades would figure things out that don't always get in, I guess, until later. Huh?
Yeah, and it's equally important to have the Renegades inside of government. Like some of the fun stories are like Higgins on the outside, but you had Admiral Rickover who built the nuclear navy. When Rickover wanted to build the nuclear-powered submarine, Oppenheimer himself told him, I don't think this is going to work. Yeah. Imagine the chutzpah, like in the face of Oppie telling you this. You're like, no, I think you're wrong. I'm going to do it. And he did it in 6 years.
I love it. What are some of the stories? Is there anyone with where Palantir itself got to be a renegade and push something through?
Well, the fun part was documenting for the first time Colonel Drew Kukor's story. So here you have this this guy who grew up in Southern California, single mother, Mormon. He didn't have a lot of money, so he went to ROTC to go to college, joined the Marines, and he became the founding father of really Maven, the Intel, the AI enterprise kind of marquee project, and kind of looking at the amount of bullshit this guy had to deal with. His nickname was the Iron Dome of Pentagon bullshit. This whole project started in the basement of the Pentagon, which is kind of the equivalent of a garage in Palo Alto, I guess, for these sorts of things. And now it is one of the most successful programs. But he suffered personal and professional slight, IG investigations, all completely made up horseshit because the bureaucracy was threatened by the amount of success that he was really having here. And it's a great lesson of like what it actually takes to be a heretic, how much you have to be willing to sacrifice for the ultimate outcome at the expense of your career.
It feels like there's so many stories of heretics, like with the airplanes from the 30s and 40s, and with Lockheed special groups early on, and like. How come they don't just like stop the bureaucracy from trying to kill heretics anymore? Like, why is it always like almost win and almost stop all these things?
Well, that question you just asked is why I wrote the book. We have to remember that we need the heretics. We have them, by the way. It's not like we're missing them. It's like heretics require two things: the space for their heresy to exist, and a modicum of protection from the top to enable that to happen right here. And so
you just need a little bit of protection.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like this is like every company needs to do this for their most talented people because the organizations always reject the talent, and your job as leader to keep them. Like Palantir was a bunch of heretics early on, right? It's basically like I felt like I was like the leader of a bunch of heretics, and we were just like beaten by the mainstream people for years and years and years. And so it's really fun. We're now, it's very funny now to be attacked as like this, like in military industrial, like leaders now. Cause we were just like beaten by the bureaucracy forever as these outsiders. Like, do you still feel like an outsider? Are you an insider now? Cause you're lieutenant colonel and Palantir is winning. Like how is your mindset changed?
Constitutionally, I'm going to always feel like an outsider. I always feel like I'm the heretic looking in. Maybe I relish that role a little bit, which is why it appeals to me. But absolutely, in the beginning of Palantir, really, like we tried to go through the front door and very much got, the front door was not an accessible door.
So disrespected. Like people just wanted us to die.
There's a positive piece of that. You carry that chip on your shoulder to like earn your place every day, and you recognize your product has to be 10 times better than the alternatives, and there's like a fire in your belly from it. But it was, I think it's motivating. it's motivating to know, look, why should it be easy for us? It wasn't easy for any of these guys.
And so chapter 11, you said factory is the weapon. What's your framework for reviving manufacturing? I'm working on this in a few ways. We're starting to scale up some things. We still have a lot of work to do. How are you thinking about this?
You can kind of break down like what are the laws of physics and what are the laws of man? And ideally our factories are marginally, if how do we break down the laws of man that are constraining the factory? How do we qualify this part? How do we do this? This is just the way we've done it. A reimagination of these processes. I do think, I'm a one-trick pony in the sense that I think everything starts with the people. And if you look at, I don't think it's fair to say that America is not great at manufacturing. Like look at SpaceX, look at Tesla. Like we have modern manufacturing marvels. They just think about manufacturing differently. And so how do we bring a kind of software, continuous iteration, co-locating R&D with production mindset, a bias towards vertical integration to really get after these things, squeezing out the deadweight loss that happens through what I think is the legacy of globalization of like, hey, we're going to just really like push out our supply chains. We're going to optimize on cost instead of innovation. That's kind of the precursor starts with that. And then recognizing the Ukraine example is really important because what we got wrong, to summarize it, would be we thought the stockpile was the deterrent. It's not the stockpile. It's the ability to generate the stockpile. And this is the frog boil that happened, which is like, well, how many of these weapons do we really need? We're not using them. Maybe we can have a little less, a little less. Let's make it a little more fancy. Let's make it more exquisite. Well, now that it's more expensive, we can afford even less. And you kind of got into this doom loop. And a recognition that, frankly, in World War II, the Germans were superior engineers. We just could produce more, and that counted for a lot. And they produced small, exquisite quantities. So today we look like the Germans, and the Chinese look like we did.
Which is why we got to fix that in 100X it. Well, we're working on it with Saronic and others. Are you seeing any companies in particular you're working on, you're excited about for scaling up manufacturing?
Well, I think a lot of the new entrants are going to have a huge role to play. Hadrian, Saronic, Anduril. But I also think like reinvigorating the existing industrial base is a huge part of this. We have a huge number of smaller, very small, they're not even medium-sized enterprises. They're small businesses that make parts. They're coming up on a succession challenge where the owner, it's a sole proprietor type thing or a limited partnership, and it's going to need to be transitioned. You need kind of outside capital to reinvest in the machine toolings and modern processes. So I think we're going to have to get both of these things to work. Certainly, we're going to need a high-low mix. Our exquisite stuff is exquisite. As we see with Epirus, this stuff really works. The real problem is that we don't have 100 times more of it. And we're going to need to invest in scaling the low end of this as well to kind of fight the future war.
A few more questions on defense. If you were in charge of fixing the culture at the Pentagon to protect heretics and to make sure we're scaling all this stuff up, like what are the number one or two things you'd focus on?
I think culture follows from execution. And, Bill Perry, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense during the Last Supper and subsequently the Secretary of Defense, like he had this fork in the road where he could think about, I could try to either fix the system or I could make sure that stealth and GPS happen by going around the system. And he chose the latter. And I think that's the wise move, which is like, how do you deliver the incredible successes that motivate the next generation of heretics, that set the path for those who are willing to see it? Because if you try to fix the system, you're going to lose. You're going to get bogged down in trench warfare. And, I think you got to fix it through inspiration.
Isn't this always the problem, though, that it's never worth fixing these really hard problems? The government we always just go around them. And so this thing just gets nastier and nastier and more broken.
I think that is a problem. I think that what I would offer you, though, is like, can you fix the system by literally trying to fix the system? Or do you have to fix the system by getting parts of it to work? Kind of like eat your way through the elephant.
Yeah. I've always thought we should just fire a ton of the core and just build new things around it, but that's apparently not appropriate.
There's a Chesterton fence question there, too, though.
What do we need that we don't know we need?
And so I think a lot of it comes down to people.
There's so many tens of thousands of people doing things that don't seem necessary to me. Am I crazy?
We're not as efficient as we could be. The only pushback I'd have on that is we built 154 different airframes in World War II. I think probably 10 of them really mattered.
Yeah.
So part of what's gotten us to this situation is a fixation on efficiency over effectiveness. Like it's a pathing question. You have to get to effectiveness first, then you can work on
just
efficiency.
Build the most effective things around it, and don't worry about trying to take it apart.
It's very much like we manage everything as if it's a 1 to n thing, when sometimes there's a 0 to 1 thing. Yep. And those things have to be managed differently.
I guess I'm probably better at 0 to 1 anyway. I should just do more 0 to 1 things around it and not worry about this giant mess in the middle. Is the right strategy.
Yeah, well, I think the 0 to 1 things as they scale end up replacing and fixing it, right? Like is easier to fix and lead with momentum